As summer was drawing to a close, with only a week left before I returned to college, my friends Mia and Rachel thought we should have one last adventure. We decided on a light hike and a simple camping trip overnight, nothing too strenuous. We just wanted a break from our usual routine of working and binge-watching shows, something that felt like a real summer memory. The morning started exactly how we planned. We packed the car with our camping gear, grabbed some snacks, and hit the road, music blasting and windows down. We must have played Don't Stop Believin' at least 5 times. The trail we picked was about an hour's drive away, a secluded spot Mia's older brother had recommended, saying we'd likely have it to ourselves. Sounded perfect. On the way, we decided it wouldn't be a proper camping trip without some beer. We pulled into a gas station, hoping we could get lucky. None of us were old enough to buy alcohol yet, but Rachel, ever the confident one, strolled into the store to try. Mia and I stayed in the car, laughing and joking. But when Rachel returned empty-handed, she shook her head, clearly frustrated. "The guy didn't even consider it," she grumbled as she got back into the driver's seat. Rachel wasn't used to being turned down, so I could tell she was a bit embarrassed. Just as we were about to abandon the beer idea, a man who had been filling up his car walked over to us. He looked ordinary enough. Average height, a little scruffy, maybe mid-20s, dressed in a decent green flannel shirt. But something about the friendly smile and how quickly he approached us made me feel slightly uneasy. He greeted us with a deep voice, "Hey there," then leaned down to Mia's window. "Need a hand getting something?" he asked, his tone casual, though his eyes lingered on each of us just a little too long. Rachel, ever bold, jumped at the offer. "Yeah, could you grab us some beers? We have cash," she said, handing him a 20. He nodded and smiled. "Sure, what kind do you want?" Although he smiled, something about him seemed off to me. But Rachel was already chatting with him, so it was too late to back out. He came back with a pack of beer and some change. "Here you go," he said, handing it over with the same smile. Then he hesitated, as if waiting for something. "Thanks," Rachel said quickly, taking the beer and giving him a quick wave, and Mia started the car. We drove off, and when I glanced back, I noticed he was still standing there, watching us. "That was odd," I murmured, but Rachel just shrugged. "Relax, he was just helping us out." The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, and soon we were hiking in the woods, surrounded by tall trees and birdsong. The trail was as beautiful as Mia's brother had promised. We took pictures, laughed, and enjoyed the calm of being out in nature. But as the day wore on, I began to feel a little uneasy. Every so often, I'd hear a faint noise, a twig snapping or leaves rustling. But each time I looked back, there was nothing. I tried to tell myself it was just normal forest sounds, but a strange feeling lingered. By the time we set up camp, the sun was setting, and our corner of the forest grew dark fast. We built a small fire, roasted marshmallows, and opened a few beers, trying to shake off the discomfort. Jess and Rachel were having a blast, and I tried to relax too, but the darkness felt heavy. As we sat around the fire, Mia suddenly mentioned the sounds, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that? It sounds like someone walking out there." Rachel immediately brushed it off, saying, "It's probably animals." But even she didn't sound totally sure. Eventually, we climbed into the tent, snuggled into our sleeping bags, and tried to sleep. But rest didn't come easily. The sounds outside began again. To me, it almost sounded like footsteps. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, and my heart was pounding. I could tell Mia and Rachel were also awake, shifting uncomfortably in their bags. After what felt like forever lying in silence, I finally whispered to the girls that I was going to check on the fire to make sure it was completely out. They nodded silently, and I unzipped the tent to step outside. The woods were pitch black, except for a faint glow from the embers. I grabbed a water bottle to pour over the coals when I heard those sounds again. Footsteps directly behind me. I froze, feeling like I couldn't breathe. Slowly, I turned around, and there, just a few feet away, stood the man from the gas station. I could barely see his face in the dim light, but I recognized the green flannel shirt. A surge of fear held me in place. I couldn't move or breathe. He simply stared, unmoving, which somehow made it even more terrifying. Finally, I found my voice. "Get away from me!" I screamed. The sound seemed to startle him, and he took a step back, then turned and dashed into the woods. I ran back to the tent, shaking Mia and Rachel awake, shouting that we needed to leave immediately. They didn't ask questions. My panic was enough to set them into motion. We packed up hastily, stuffing everything into our bags without bothering to fold the tent. The trail back was nerve-wracking. We couldn't see much, and every little noise sent us into a panic, making us walk faster. We finally reached the car before dawn, and the drive back was silent as we tried to process what had happened. Looking back, we probably should have called the police right then, but all we could think about was getting away. When we got to Mia's house, we just sat in the driveway trying to calm down. Eventually, I called the police, giving them a description of the man from the gas station and the rough time we'd seen him. Rachel was nervous about mentioning the beer, but I felt it was more important to report the encounter. Years have passed, and we never found out who he was or what he wanted. Sometimes I still think about that night, about seeing him standing in the darkness, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone out to check the fire. It's a memory that haunts me, and I can only hope that he was just a strange, overly curious person and nothing worse. In college, you assume projects are straightforward. Choose a topic, research, and present what you find, hopefully learning something along the way. That's what my friend Miguel and I thought when we enrolled in a course that required making a documentary. We figured it would be a nice break from our usual workload. The assignment sounded easy enough: film a short documentary. But being the ambitious pair we were, we decided to aim higher, to make something unique and intriguing. That's how we ended up deep in an allegedly haunted forest near our town, planning to disprove the eerie tales that had kept people away for years. The forest had an odd beauty: towering trees, lush undergrowth, and an eerie quietness that made it feel almost therapeutic, until you noticed the silence felt heavy, as if the place was holding its breath. Generations of stories surrounded this forest. Local tribes considered it sacred, and, predictably, tales of ghosts, spirits, and forbidden rituals followed. In my view, it was just exaggerated folklore. People passed down these stories, adding layers with each retelling, so the tales became distorted over time. Locals stayed clear of the forest, and those who ventured in often came back uneasy, speaking of strange energies. I didn't believe in the supernatural, and neither did Miguel. To us, it was just superstition, which made it a perfect subject for our documentary. We wanted to peel back the layers and show that these woods were simply trees and shadows. We spent hours filming, capturing scenes of sunlight filtering through the leaves, the thick vegetation, and even a few caves scattered throughout the forest. The forest was objectively beautiful. One small cave drew us in. It wasn't deep, but the light hitting the rocks gave it an ominous look that suited our project's vibe. While we were setting up in the cave, something shifted. Clouds covered the sun, and the forest sounds seemed to fade. Miguel stopped abruptly, asking in a low voice if I heard anything. I hadn't, but the tense look on his face made me uneasy. We listened closely, and then I heard it too. A sound coming from outside the cave. It wasn't the wind. The steps drew closer, then faded away as if retreating. We exchanged nervous looks, trying to laugh off our jitters, but in that moment, I felt a flicker of fear. My mind searched for logical explanations, another hiker perhaps, or a passing animal. But the more we stood there, the more those ideas felt hollow. Trying to keep calm, I suggested we pack up, and Miguel quickly agreed. We gathered our gear, playing it cool, but it was clear we were both on edge. As we left the cave, the forest seemed darker than before. The sun was dipping behind clouds, and a creeping sense of dread hung in the air. We'd barely made it out when the sounds came again, louder and closer. We stopped to listen as the noise shifted into distinct footsteps. Turning around, I caught sight of two figures moving through the trees. Their shapes were shadowy, blurring with the dim light. We didn't wait around to investigate, we ran. I glanced back a few times, trying to see who or what was following us, but it was impossible to make out any details. They moved swiftly and quietly, almost as if gliding through the trees. As we ran, their steps grew louder until it felt like they were nearly on top of us. I risked one last look and saw their forms more clearly. They were human-like, yet something was off in their movements. They wore dark clothing and seemed to float effortlessly through the forest. Miguel noticed I was slowing down, shouted at me to keep up, and we finally made a last dash for the car. We dove in, locking the doors, Miguel's hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. When the engine finally roared to life, relief washed over me, until I noticed the dashboard warning about low tire pressure. Miguel looked confused but didn't dwell on it. He threw the car into gear, but as soon as we tried to drive, the vehicle lurched. All our tires were flat, slashed clean through. I leaned out to confirm, and before we could process it, movement in the tree line caught my eye. 3 figures appeared, not just 2 walking towards us. My stomach tightened as I realized these were the same shadowy forms we'd seen before. They weren't spirits, but real people dressed in black, faces concealed by smooth, blank masks. Miguel tried calling for help, but the weak signal kept failing. Finally, he got through to someone, desperately shouting our location before the call dropped again. Now that they were closer, I could see small details. A slender build, glittering nail polish on one figure's hand. This small human detail somehow made the situation even worse. They were real people, not supernatural beings, yet just as terrifying. One of them started pounding on the window, while the others slammed on the car doors. Each hit rattled the car, and the glass began to crack. I heard them laughing, which somehow made everything even more sinister. The glass was seconds from shattering when lights appeared behind us. A park ranger's truck, its siren blaring. The masked figures froze, and with one look at the incoming vehicle, they turned and vanished into the trees. The ranger pulled up beside us, concern and confusion on his face as he approached. We assured him we were okay, though we were both badly shaken. He called for backup, and we left our car behind, grateful to escape those woods. At the station, police questioned us, and we recounted everything. Later, they managed to catch one of the masked people, a large man with roses tattooed on his temples, their stems winding down his neck. When asked why he did it, he only grinned and replied, "Because I could. I wanted to. No remorse, no empathy, only satisfaction." They never found the other 2, nor uncovered any motive, leaving an unsettling mystery in those woods. Miguel and I left the woods convinced they weren't haunted, but the monsters lurking there were human all along. In the fall of 2017, my partner and I, along with our friends Mike and Sarah, had organized a hiking trip. We'd all been looking forward to it for weeks, as it was rare for us to get a whole weekend off together since we worked in completely different fields. When we finally got the chance, we eagerly grabbed it, planning to leave early on Saturday morning and spend the day exploring the mountains. We had picked out a trail that was supposed to have beautiful views, and all of us were excited to disconnect from the everyday grind. The drive to the trailhead was relaxing, with the sun just starting to rise, casting a warm golden glow across everything. We were laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying the early start. But as soon as we pulled up to the trailhead, our enthusiasm took a hit. The sky darkened suddenly, and within minutes it started pouring rain, so heavy that visibility was almost zero. We hoped it was just a passing shower, so we decided to wait it out in the car. After all, we had driven all this way and weren't about to turn back so soon. Rain hammered down on the roof, fogging up the windows. It wasn't the beginning we'd planned, but we were determined to make the best of it. After about 20 minutes, the rain finally lightened, leaving behind a misty and gray atmosphere. We debated whether to continue, but the trail was calling to us, and none of us wanted to waste the trip. We gathered our gear and set out. However, we didn't get far before the rain started again, even harder this time. It felt like someone had turned on a giant faucet, and we were drenched within seconds. Laughing and grumbling, we hurried back to the car, trying to shield ourselves from the downpour. But as we reached the car, we noticed something that made us all freeze. A young woman stood next to our vehicle, completely soaked. Her clothes clung to her in tatters, and she looked exhausted, with matted hair and dirt smeared across her face. At first, I thought the rain was playing tricks on my eyes, but she was indeed real, standing right beside the car, staring through the windows. Acting on instinct, I called out, "Hey, get away from the car." My reaction was more out of fear than anything else. But she didn't budge. She just kept staring at us with hollow, lifeless eyes, like a deer frozen in headlights. Before I could shout again, my partner grabbed my arm and whispered that she might be hurt. Sarah and Mike stayed silent, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to let the stranger into our car, but I also couldn't ignore the possibility that she might be in trouble. Against my better judgment, we all squeezed into the SUV, with the woman in the back seat beside my partner, who tried to comfort her. The air felt thick with tension, turning what was supposed to be a relaxing hike into a strange and unsettling situation. The woman barely spoke. In fact, she said nothing at all. She sat shivering and staring straight ahead, which only heightened our unease. My partner whispered that she might be in shock and started guessing about what might have happened to her. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, but we couldn't tell if it was from the rain or tears. We tried asking her what happened, but she didn't respond. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, trying to read her expression, but her face was blank, as if no one was really home. Mike suggested driving to the nearest gas station to call for help, and we all agreed. We had no cell signal, so that was our best option. I started the car and began navigating the slick, muddy road as the wipers struggled against the relentless rain. I know it's easy to say this now, but something about her felt wrong to me. The way she'd appeared out of nowhere, her eerie silence, and the fact that she seemed unfazed by the cold or the rain. It all set me on edge. We were only a couple of minutes from the gas station when the woman suddenly let out a piercing scream, so loud and shrill that I nearly lost control of the car. She started thrashing in the back seat, pounding on the windows and seats, making it impossible for me to steer properly. I struggled to keep us on the road, but with the rain and the slippery conditions, the car skidded off into a ditch. After the car came to a stop, there was silence except for the pounding rain. We were all trying to catch our breath, stunned by what had just happened. Then, out of nowhere, the woman started laughing, a cold, hollow sound that cut through the tension like a knife. I had a minor scrape on my forehead from hitting the steering wheel, but everyone else was unharmed. Mike, furious, shouted, "What is wrong with you?" The woman's laughter abruptly stopped, and she pulled a small blade from inside her shirt. It looked like a box cutter. She held my partner by the neck with her left arm and pressed the blade against Sarah's throat with her right. In a chillingly calm voice, she demanded, "Give me all your cash." There was no fear in her voice, only a twisted satisfaction. We didn't hesitate. We handed over our money and whatever else we had, too terrified to resist. My partner was crying. Mike was muttering under his breath, and I was just trying to keep myself together. The woman grabbed the money, opened the car door, and bolted into the rain without a backward glance. We sat there in stunned silence, watching her disappear into the storm. After a moment, I restarted the car, and my partner shut the door as we made our way to the gas station. We reported the incident, but by then, the woman was long gone. The police took our statements but didn't seem hopeful about finding her. This event happened around 7 years back. I'll change names here for privacy reasons, and this is just a temporary account and the only time I'll post under it. I was with my girlfriend, we'll call her Jamie, for 3 years at that point. We both had a passion for the outdoors. Hiking, fishing, picnics, you name it. We enjoyed taking spontaneous drives to different parks to explore. One Saturday morning, we decided on a hike that was quite a drive from home. I packed some camping supplies just in case we wanted to stay overnight or sleep in the car, depending on the weather. We weren't keen on spending the night if it started raining, even if we had the car. The hike began smoothly. The soft sounds of running water, birds, insects, and other wildlife around us. It was what kept us drawn to nature, an escape from the busyness of everyday life. Hiking gave us a chance to clear our heads and reconnect. We usually spent our time together talking about our future, our dreams like a wedding, the kind of house we'd like, or the neighborhood where we might settle down. We also fantasized about having a cozy winter getaway someday and hoped that not having kids would give us financial freedom to travel. It may sound odd, but our best conversations always seemed to happen during these hikes. However, as we went deeper into the woods, I started to feel a strange sense of unease. It was as if the peaceful sounds had shifted. The chirps and rustling around us had a different vibe, and even the water flowing from far behind began to sound like soft whispers. It felt as if someone was watching or trying to get my attention. I quickly brushed it off and kept up our conversation. Not long after, I found myself feeling unusually tired and asked Jamie if we could pause for a break. I was surprised because I usually didn't need to rest. I assumed it was because I hadn't stayed hydrated. After the break, I noticed Jamie's mood seemed to change. She seemed quieter and a little irritated. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring she might be tired too, so I tried to keep our conversation light. But then she became downright snappy. Every time I said something, she responded with a sarcastic or rude remark. At first, I thought she was joking, but soon it was clear she wasn't. I asked if she wanted to turn back, take another break, or maybe just walk in silence, hoping to improve the situation. She refused to speak, wearing a cold expression. I racked my brain, trying to recall if I'd said or done anything that might have upset her, but I couldn't think of anything. As we reached the farthest point we'd planned to go on our hike, Jamie suddenly had a full-blown meltdown, screaming and crying at the same time. When I approached to see what was wrong, she became aggressive, wildly swinging her arms. One of her arms struck my temple, knocking my glasses off. I'm practically blind without them, so I panicked, searching the ground to find them. This kind of behavior was entirely out of character for her. Jamie was never the type to act unpredictably like this. I scrambled on the ground to find my glasses, feeling like a cartoon character, while Jamie was still waving her arms and running away, shouting. Luckily, I managed to find my glasses quickly and caught up to her. When I finally reached her, she seemed disoriented. Her eyes weren't glazed over, but they looked distant, as if she were there physically but not fully present. It's hard to describe, but that's the best way I can explain it. She had stopped yelling and calmed down a bit, so I sat her down and gave her some water. She was still quiet but seemed to be regaining her composure. Once I felt she could walk again, we started making our way back to the car. As we moved away from the spot where she'd had her breakdown, she seemed to return to her normal self. She began talking again and asked if I remembered what happened. She claimed she didn't recall anything, and she was embarrassed and apologetic for her behavior. When we were about half a mile from the car, she seemed completely herself again. I was still trying to make sense of what had happened. In the 3 years we'd been together, through both the highs and lows of life, I'd never seen her act that way. She believed in the paranormal and was convinced something dark had affected her. I wasn't so sure. I thought there must be a logical reason behind it. After looking into it, I found that there are certain plants in those woods that can cause strange reactions, from fevers to hallucinations. I figured she must have somehow come into contact with something like that, which could explain the episode. Maybe I had even brushed against it earlier in the hike, causing the anxiety I'd felt. Without any definitive answers, I settled on one simple solution: to never hike there again. Has anyone else gone through something like this? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Some of my most cherished memories as a child are when my mom took me to brownies. It's funny how certain things stick out more than others. I don't remember the cookie sales, but I clearly remember my mother sewing badges onto my uniform. I'm not sure if these moments linger in my mind more because I later lost my mom, and this was one of our main activities together, or because I was so curious and eager to learn at a young age. Either way, being part of brownies has remained a significant part of my life well into adulthood. I've been a regular volunteer, even though I haven't yet had children of my own to pass these experiences on to. The story I'm sharing today is one I've never written down before, so bear with me as I recount it. It was one of our annual camping trips for the troop, with plenty of food, fun activities, hiking, and things to keep the girls busy. I always helped out with meals and some of the arts and crafts. I'd often spend my own money on snacks and find activities to entertain the kids who didn't want to join in with the outdoor events. When I was young, I often felt out of place and would have preferred more art-focused activities to help me feel at ease on these trips. This trip began just like any other. The leaders were mostly moms of the kids and volunteers like myself. Early in the morning, we kicked off with a hike, something we always started with because the kids were eager to explore, and it would likely tire them out for a good night's sleep later on. The hike seemed ordinary at first, safe and routine, which is exactly what you'd want on an excursion buzzing with excited kids. Then, out of nowhere, I felt everything go completely silent. My ears and sinuses felt plugged, and all I could hear was a buzzing sound. When I snapped out of it, I took a look around and noticed that one of the girls, Katie, was missing. I quickly scanned the line of children but didn't see her. Trying not to alarm anyone, I started calling her name, walking forward to check if she might have wandered ahead with another group. I bumped into one of the moms, asked if she'd seen Katie, and must have looked panicked because she instantly came back with me and began calling Katie's name too. Several minutes passed as we kept everyone still to take inventory and see if anyone else was missing. At this point, real worry was starting to set in. We were about to contact authorities to report a missing child when we suddenly spotted Katie casually strolling off the trail, a little way into the trees. I hurried over to check on her, and she seemed completely fine. Not scared or startled, just calm and collected. I took her hand, and as we walked back to the group, someone reminded all the girls to stay in a single file and not to wander off. Normally quiet and shy, Katie was unusually chatty and full of energy, which was unlike her. I teasingly asked what had put her in such a cheerful mood, and she told me about a friend she had met in the woods who had warned her about a man in the dark cave. I stopped, baffled. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling uneasy. "Who did you meet in the woods? Did anyone hurt you?" She only smiled at me in a strange way, saying her new friend was nice and wouldn't harm her, but that she should stay away from the man in the dark cave. A chill went down my spine. I don't remember what else I asked her or her exact answers. I was just focused on making sure she hadn't actually encountered someone unsafe. I wondered if her imagination had simply run wild, stirred by the vastness of the forest. That night, I struggled to sleep, my mind replaying her words about the man in the dark cave. Thankfully, the rest of the weekend passed without any incidents, and everyone returned home safe and happy. I eventually buried that experience deep in my memory, and years went by without thinking of it again, until we returned to that same forest for another camping trip. I hadn't recalled the incident until one night, sitting outside again, unable to sleep. I noticed a little girl getting up from her tent. I asked if she was okay, offering to help if she needed the bathroom. She told me she was just having trouble sleeping. I explained that it could be difficult to rest when we're not in our own beds, but she said that wasn't it. She told me she'd been having nightmares, saying her friend kept waking her up, telling her she needed to see the man in the dark cave. My heart sank. I felt my hearing go faint as I asked her who was telling her to go there. She struggled to explain, so I couldn't tell if it was just a bad dream or something more. Hearing about the man in the dark cave again after so many years, this couldn't be a coincidence. I gently tucked her back in, telling her to let me know if she was woken again. She slept through the rest of the night, but I didn't close my eyes even once. The next day, we all went home, and I've never returned to that campsite. Some years back, I spent a summer as a lifeguard at a resort tucked away in the forested hills. It wasn't exactly a major vacation spot, but it did get a steady flow of guests. Many visitors came to escape city life, hike some trails, and find peace and quiet in the woods. The resort had a main lodge, several cabins scattered around, and a pool that, on most days, was used more for lounging than swimming. On one quiet afternoon, I was on lifeguard duty, keeping an eye out to make sure no one got too rowdy. The usual guests were there, mostly couples and young adults, including a group celebrating a bachelorette party. I noticed a man standing by the fence separating the pool from the rest of the property. He was dressed to swim, just watching the group of women at the bachelorette party. They were sunbathing, laughing, and chatting by the pool's shallow end. Initially, I didn't think much of it since it wasn't unusual for people to ask questions about the pool rules or hours. But this guy didn't ask anything. He just stood there, staring, and eventually tried talking to the women. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but from their uncomfortable body language and avoidance of eye contact, I could tell they weren't interested. After a few minutes, I decided to step in. I walked over casually and asked if he had a pool pass. He looked at me with a blank expression, and I thought he might argue, but he just mumbled something and walked away. The women looked relieved, and one of them, a brunette with a bright smile, thanked me, saying he had been giving them the creeps. Trying to sound cool, I told them I was just doing my job. We got to talking, and she introduced herself as Amy. Her friends, Sarah, Jen, and Cassie, were there celebrating Jen's upcoming wedding. They invited me to a little gathering at their cabin later that night. Since I didn't have plans, I decided to go. That evening, as the sun was setting and the air turned cooler, I headed to their cabin. It was cozy with a small porch overlooking the trees, and they'd set up snacks, drinks, and soft music. A few more people were supposed to join, but it ended up just being the 5 of us. We talked, laughed, and after a few drinks, someone suggested a short night walk. I wasn't thrilled, knowing the kinds of animals that roamed these woods after dark, but I went along. We took flashlights and stuck to a path that looped around the resort. As we walked, the typical sounds of the forest surrounded us. crickets chirping and leaves rustling. But after a while, I started hearing footsteps behind us, like someone was quietly following. Amy looked visibly uneasy and asked if anyone else had heard it. We stopped and listened, hearing quick, erratic movements nearby. It didn't sound like any usual forest sounds, but something more deliberate. Sarah and Jen decided they'd had enough and wanted to go back. The rest of us agreed, picking up the pace. By the time we got back, the atmosphere had shifted, and we felt a nervous tension in the air. We locked the doors, but it was hard to shake off the feeling of being watched. We tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness. Just then, Cassie and Jen decided they wanted to go back outside. Minutes later, we heard footsteps approaching the cabin. They were heavy, slow, and seemed to circle the place. Sarah froze and asked if we had locked the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and checked, feeling anxious but trying to stay calm. Just as I made sure the door was secure, we heard a loud bang at the front. Cassie and Jen burst into the room, saying someone had been chasing them through the woods. I moved to close the door, and that's when I saw him. A man with a hood was sprinting toward me. He lunged, knocking me to the floor, and I struggled as he reached for something in his waistband. Just as I thought I was done, I heard a loud thud, and the weight on me shifted. Looking up, I saw Amy holding a large stick, her face pale but resolute. She'd hit him hard, and he was out cold. We immediately called the police, who arrived surprisingly fast given the resort's secluded location. It turned out the guy was a new maintenance worker at the resort who'd just started a few days earlier. He'd been using his job to observe guests, though what he had planned that night, we'd rather not imagine. Charges were filed and he was arrested. Reflecting on it now, I still can't believe some people can have such dark intentions. My ex-boyfriend, who I'll call Jake, and I loved taking trips and exploring new places whenever we could, even if just for a weekend. We both enjoy the quiet and love to camp or hike away from crowded spots, where we can really feel secluded and get a break from the world. So, Jake heard from a colleague about a challenging trail that was supposed to be pretty isolated, and we thought it would be a fun way to test ourselves and escape for a bit. When we arrived, we found a good flat spot to set up our big tent and made ourselves comfortable before starting the hike. I was excited but a bit nervous as the trail was fairly steep. Not long into our trek, we ran into another couple hiking along the same trail. I'm naturally shy and was hoping for privacy, but the couple came over, introduced themselves, and started chatting. They were surprisingly friendly and had a lot of useful information about the area, which put us both at ease. They even suggested we continue hiking together, and we figured it wouldn't hurt since we could always split off later if we felt like it. About 45 minutes in, I started falling behind a bit, and the man, who I'll call Dan, slowed down to chat with me. At first, he was friendly, but then he started making comments about my fitness, complimenting my arms and even touching my arm and hand to emphasize his point. I pulled away, suddenly uncomfortable and wanting to distance myself. Meanwhile, when I caught up with Jake, he mentioned that the woman had also made an inappropriate comment toward him, making him feel equally uneasy. At that point, we decided to part ways, thanked them for their company, and headed back to our campsite. Once back, I realized my bracelet and ring were missing, which was odd since I rarely take them off. I racked my brain trying to figure out when I could have lost them. Then it hit me when Dan had touched my arm. Jake offered to search the trail the next morning to see if he could spot them, and we went to bed early. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by the sound of a branch snapping, followed by what sounded like faint whispers. I nudged Jake awake, and he listened quietly before peeking out of the tent. He suddenly called out, asking someone what they were doing there, and it turned out to be the couple. They claimed to have wandered over because they saw a bear nearby and wanted to warn us. Jake thanked them but came back into the tent, put his finger to his lips, and whispered, "Grab what you can and get in the car." He didn't explain at first but was firm. We quickly packed up the essentials, even half-packed the tent, and drove off immediately. Later, Jake told me he had seen Dan holding a knife and felt unsafe staying there. When we got home, I decided to look them up online, using the names they had given us. What I found left me chilled. A couple with those names had died on a camping trip years before. The photos confirmed they were not the people we met. What they wanted with us, whether it was to rob us or something more sinister, I'll never know. But I'm glad we trusted our instincts and left when we did.